Last Sunday on New Year's Eve, we talked about surrender as an important component of any change that we desire in our lives. And we resolved to make 2018 a year of surrender, to surrendering to God's work in our lives. We said that this process of surrender begins with prayer, of kneeling before the King of Kings. That is where this journey begins. But I've become convinced that this journey is sustained and continues by a transformational process that we like to call discipleship. This morning we're beginning a new sermon series titled Follow Me, where over the next several weeks we're going to explore what we mean by this churchy word, discipleship. We're going to talk about different levels on this transformational journey or stages of discipleship and examine where we see ourselves in this journey that we are on together. But today we're going to start by talking, what do we even mean by the word discipleship? Even in English, you can see the root word of discipleship is disciple. But we get that word from the Greek word. The New Testament was written in Greek, and so the word of the New Testament that we translate into English as disciple is mathetes. Mathetes is often translated disciple, and that's a good translation for it, but it could also be translated as apprentice, student, follower, pupil. And so we have all these words that help us really grasp the true meaning of the word disciple. And so if you think about disciple in this wide range of words that are all connected to this one Greek word, you realize that every person who has ever lived has been a disciple of someone or something. I mean, just think about growing up in school and perhaps teachers that you were students or learners or followers of. Teachers that you looked up to, or maybe even in college or today, role models that you had that you try to pattern or model your life after. In fact, in the business world, maybe some of you have apprenticed under different people as you have journeyed on your corporate career, and so you have been a disciple of them. All of us have been disciples of someone or something, and maybe images are coming to mind of people that you have been a disciple of in the course of your life, a learner, a student, a follower of. Maybe some of you are still struggling to understand this concept that all of us are disciples in some form or the other. And so if you are still kind of wrestling with this statement, just think about what you looked like 10, 20, 30, 40, even 50 years ago. Think back to photos taken of you over the decades, and you will realize that we have all been discipled by culture. I mean, think of the clothes that we were wearing. Think of the bell-bottom jeans, or the high-waisted pants, or the bright-colored makeup, or the big hairdos that many had, or the puffy sleeves. Think about the music you listened to, the cars that you drove. And now, as you think back on all those things, if you're like me, you probably want to do a face palm of like, I can't believe I used to think that was cool, or that I wore that, or I looked like that. But all of us, in some level, have been discipled by culture over the time periods of our lives, that all of us are disciples of someone or something. And we, who call ourselves Christians, are to be disciples first and foremost of the person of Jesus Christ. That Jesus is to be our number one teacher, our role model, our leader in our lives. Now, we may know this to be true on an intellectual level. We may know, yes, we are to be disciples of Jesus. That's what we're called to be. But we might not really know what that looks like. We may have heard about this from time to time. We may have heard Jesus' favorite teaching, the Great Commission, that we are commanded to go and make disciples of all nations. We may know this to be true on an intellectual level. But we might not know how to apply this, of how to actually live as a disciple in the 21st century. I mean, Jesus is not physically present here for us to follow around like those early disciples. So how do we live as a follower, a student of Jesus today, in our lives today? And many of us don't really know what this looks like, and it's not actually all of our fault, because unfortunately, over the last several years, there has been a discipleship deficiency in the church in America. For some reason, we stopped talking about discipleship in America, we came up with this terribly false notion that somehow we could be Christians forever without actually becoming disciples, without actually patterning our lives after Jesus. We forgot that discipleship is foundational to what it means to be a Christian, and we came up with this terribly false idea that all it means to be Christian is to just be a good moral person and come to church on Sundays and say your prayers, and that's it. And we forgot the true depth and richness of all that it means to follow after Jesus and to partner with just Jesus' mission in the world. And the body of Christ, the church that was supposed to be so active and vibrant and growing in the world and in America, in the States, began to decline and atrophy because we forgot about the importance of being a disciple, of being students of Jesus. For some reason, so many of us got so comfortable to position ourselves in front of the television and allow ourselves to be discipled hours and hours every day by culture. But yet we refuse to position ourselves at the feet of Jesus to be discipled by Jesus. And because the church in America has had this discipleship deficiency, it has caused a huge transformation problem. I don't know about you, but I don't hear as many stories coming out of local churches today about the transformative power of Jesus really transforming thousands and thousands of people's lives. I mean, this was not always true. In the history of the church in America, there were times when thousands upon thousands of people were being changed by the power of Jesus. I think back to the mid-1800s with the First and Second Great Awakenings, and our own Methodist movement was a part of that time in history when thousands upon thousands of people were being transformed by the power of Jesus, of hearing the good news of what it meant to follow Jesus, and lives were radically being changed. Or think into the 1900s, the early 1900s, there was something known as the social gospel movement, where Christians in America began to realize there was so much more to their faith than simply this spiritual aspect of them and God, but that there was this outward dimension of their faith that required them to love others, to love God by serving others. And so people's lives were radically being transformed as they got involved in God's mission and work in the world. Or even think up until recently, toward the end of the 1900s, where we had the evangelical movement, and people like Billy Graham were preaching, and thousands of people's lives were being changed by the good news of Jesus Christ. There were moments in the church's history in America where thousands of stories were being told about people's lives being transformed, about new disciples and followers of Jesus being made. But we don't hear those same stories as often. We have a discipleship deficiency that's caused a terrible lack of transformation in the church and in the world in America. And so this is a kind of bleak situation. I mean, what are we going to do about this discipleship deficiency, this transformation problem? And so as I thought about this problem, I thought about the words of Paul in Romans chapter 12. In Romans chapter 12, Paul writes this: I appeal to you, therefore, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds, that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. Paul writes these words to the early church, urging them to offer their whole bodies, their entire selves, to God. That this sacrifice, this true and full surrender of all that they are and all that they have, is seen as an act of worship and is pleasing to God, that our surrender pleases God. And Paul writes these words to caution the early Christians and to caution us today that we are not to be conformed to this world. Instead, we are to be renewed by our minds to know God's will. The end goal of spiritual transformation is to know and do the will of God, but so many of us get sucked up and drawn and caught up and conformed to this world. We become so glued to the television and so in sync with social media and so enamored by Hollywood that we allow ourselves to be conformed and discipled by the world. But for we who call ourselves Christians, there's a different way. A process of transformation. That we don't have to be conformed to this world, but that we can be transformed. This process of transformation we call discipleship, and it's kind of like the process of making Christmas cookies. I love making Christmas cookies, and making Christmas cookies in my family is a big deal. We often dedicate an entire day to making Christmas cookies, dozens and dozens of them. Often there's some combination of chocolate and peanut butter, which I'm a huge fan of those two ingredients, so it's a win-win for me. But the crowning event of making Christmas cookies is when we would make cut-out Christmas cookies and decorate them. And for anyone who's made cut-out Christmas cookies, it's quite a process. It's quite involved and takes some time. You have to take your ordinary baking ingredients, some sugar and flour and butter, a little salt, a little nutmeg for flavor, eggs, and you mix it all together, and then you get to begin to form this dough and roll it out and cut it into all sorts of different wonderful shapes, and you bake it, and then you have to wait for it to cool so that you can finally ice it with lots of icing and sprinkles, and then you finally get a beautiful transformed end product. That was well worth the journey of making these delicious cookies. And this process of transformation, this journey of discipleship, is a lot like making Christmas cookies. You see, we are all those ordinary baking elements. We're the butter, the sugar, the flour, a little salt, a little nutmeg, all mixed together as part of the family of God. And we become this dough that God is forming and shaping and transforming our lives, shaping, molding, cutting us into the image of Christ. And that's the journey that we're on. And some of us are at different stages of this journey, and we yearn for the day where we will be completely iced and adorned with sprinkles, as we will be completely transformed into the image of God. And you see, when we're on this journey, as we are the dough being formed and shaped, sometimes we get a little sticky, and we get stuck to the counter, and we begin to resist the process of transformation. Sometimes our worry and our anxiety, sometimes our attraction and addiction to wealth or good or bad things in our world keeps us from being transformed into the image of God. Sometimes our own sin and shame and brokenness, the things that we keep doing even though we know we shouldn't, keep us from being shaped into the image of God. And so we find ourselves in this process and this journey of discipleship. And so I want to give us this morning a really clear definition of discipleship so we can begin to realize, where are we on this journey? Where are we on this cookie cutter process of discipleship? And so I'm going to give us a definition of discipleship based on this verse straight out of Matthew 4:19. Jesus is near the Sea of Galilee, and he sees two fishermen, Andrew and Peter, and he calls to them and says, "Follow me, and I will make you fish for people." And we're going to break down this verse into three sections of the three different phrases in this sentence, and we're going to have, by the time we're done, a complete definition of discipleship. So let's start with the first two words, follow me. This is an invitation from Jesus for these men and for us to follow Jesus and to enter into a relationship with Jesus. Now, this relationship with Jesus is not an equal relationship. Jesus and us are not equals in this relationship. Instead, Jesus is the teacher, the leader, the master, the Lord, and we are the student, the disciple, the follower. No student is ever greater than their teacher. And so in this relationship with Jesus, we come to know Jesus and acknowledge Jesus as the Lord, the leader, and the master of our lives. That means we position ourselves behind Jesus. We are the follower. Jesus is the leader. And we come to echo those famous words of John the Baptist in John 3:30. 30, where Jesus should become greater and we become less. Or Jesus must increase and we must decrease. And this is a head level of discipleship. It's the first step where we come to know Jesus as the Lord in our life. That's the first step of discipleship. The second part is the phrase, I will make you. These words begin to move what we know about Jesus on an intellectual level in our heads. And it begins to move from our heads into our hearts. Because what we know about Jesus begins to change how we view the world and what we see going on around us and judgment calls that we make about the world in which we live. And then it begins to move into our hearts, where the Holy Spirit begins to work in us and our priorities and our attitudes begin to change. This is a level of radical transformation. This is the cookie cutter part of discipleship, where our hearts are being changed and transformed more and more like Jesus. And all of a sudden we are drawn to be closer and to spend more time with Jesus, to get to know Jesus better through those incredible spiritual practices like prayer and scripture reading and taking time in silence and solitude and worship and service. And this is where we find our hearts transformed to be more like Jesus. And then those last words of the phrase, fish for people, that's the hands level part of transformation. Where now that our hearts, our attitudes, our priorities have shifted, now we realize that our hands can be used in service for Christ's mission. What Jesus meant by this to Andrew and Peter is that, Andrew and Peter, you are great fishermen, but you're going to stop using your hands and your skills and your talents just to fish in the Sea of Galilee. But instead, you're going to go out and fish for people of all nations. You're going to help make disciples of all people. And that's what Jesus says to us today, that you will use your gifts, your talents, your resources, your hands in service to God's kingdom to help make disciples of all nations. This is what it means to be a disciple of Jesus Christ. This is what discipleship looks like. That a disciple of Jesus Christ is someone who knows and follows Christ at a head level, who is being changed by Jesus Christ at a heart level, and is committed to the mission of Christ in making disciples of all nations. That's what it means to be a disciple. Notice that discipleship does not just stop at the head level. It's not just about information. It doesn't stop at the heart level. It's not just about behavior modification and being a good person and saying and doing your Christian practices. But it goes all the way from your head, through your heart, to your hands. That you get to be active and participate in God's mission to make disciples of all people. This is what it means to be a disciple. And I hope already you're beginning to think this morning of where you find yourself on this journey. Maybe some of you are in the head level, and that's great. That's the first step of becoming a disciple. Maybe some of you have moved from the head level. The knowledge that you've known about Christ maybe for years is beginning to impact and change your heart. And so maybe you're there and you're finding yourself drawn to God and spiritual practices in a way you have never felt before, and that's incredible. Maybe some of you are in the hands level, where you're ready and excited and passionate about wanting to go out and partner with God's mission in the world and help make disciples of all people. And that's incredible. So I encourage you to think about, where are you this morning in this journey of discipleship? And we're going to talk more about this in the weeks to come. Also, I want to invite you all to be a part of this upcoming discipleship study we're going to do. So on the back of your Connect card, if you are at all interested in being part of this real-life discipleship study that we're going to begin at the end of January, check that on the back of your Connect card. And then I want to pick out some times that are going to be best for as many of you as possible who are interested in joining this study. So I did some brainstorming, and I thought about Sundays right after church would be a great time if you would bring your lunch and we could do this study together then. So if that works for you, check Sundays. Wednesday nights at 7:30 was another time that I thought might be good for us. So Wednesdays work, check that. And if none of those times work for your schedule, but you would really like to be a part of this small group study, then feel free to write that on this line. Maybe Thursdays at 2 o'clock work best for you, or whenever would work best in your schedule. So please note that and put it in the kind of offering plate as it goes by. If you were not able to be here this Sunday, but would like to be a part of this small group discipleship study, just send me an email at hsledge@sunc.org, and I'd love to hear about your interest in being a part of this study. So I hope this morning you have a better idea of what it means to be a disciple, that you can begin to think about where your head and your heart and your hands are being changed by Christ, that we, like Christmas cookies, are being molded and cut into the image of Christ, and it's a process that takes time, and often it's much messier than we would like to imagine. But it's a journey that's worth it, that has the potential to radically transform our lives this year. And it's a journey I invite you to join me on as we continue in this study